Hand over your badge." The captain's voice was cold. The crowd gasped. The officer swallowed hard. He thought he could get away with it, until Shaq flipped the script. Cameras rolled. The officer's hands shook. "You just ruined your career," the police captain growled. Shaq smirked. "Should have thought about that before pulling me over." The officer sneered at Shaq, until his radio crackled. "Stand down." "That's Shaquille O'Neal." His face went pale. The power shift happened in an instant. And Shaq, he wasn't letting this slide. "All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from." Bright blue and red lights reflected off the tinted windows of Shaq's SUV, flashing like an alarm that something was about to go down. Shaq exhaled slowly, gripping the steering wheel as the police cruiser pulled up behind him. No sirens, no warnings, just a shadow tailing him for the last few blocks. He had noticed it from the moment he left the freeway, a patrol car that seemed to be studying his every turn, waiting for something. Now, as the lights flicked on, the unspoken message was clear. "Pull over." Shaq kept his movements slow and deliberate as he guided the massive SUV to the curb. He knew how these situations could go south fast. The engine hummed softly as he put the car in park, his fingers flexing slightly. He wasn't nervous. He had been in plenty of situations like this before, but there was something about this stop that felt off. A heavy-set officer stepped out of the cruiser, his boots thudding against the pavement with a sense of authority that had nothing to do with the law, and everything to do with power. He adjusted his belt, tilted his head, and strutted toward the driver's side window with a smirk that immediately set Shaq on edge. This wasn't a routine stop. This was something else. The officer didn't bother with the usual introduction. No request for license and registration. No explanation for why he pulled Shaq over. Instead, he leaned against the SUV, his elbow casually resting on the door like they were old friends. Then he smiled. Not a friendly smile. The kind of smile that said, "I got you." "Didn't expect to see a car like this in a neighborhood like this," the officer said, tilting his head as he eyed the customized vehicle. Shaq stayed quiet for a moment, letting the words sink in. Ah, so that's what this is about. A few pedestrians had slowed their steps, glancing over but trying not to be obvious about it. A couple across the street whispered something to each other. Shaq knew that look on the officer's face. He had seen it before, on bouncers who thought he wasn't dressed right for their clubs, on real estate agents who assumed he was looking at homes he couldn't afford. It wasn't about the car. It was about him sitting in it. He could already see where this was going. The officer wasn't looking for a traffic violation. He was looking for a reason. Shaq inhaled deeply, exhaled slowly, and met the officer's gaze head-on. "You want to tell me why you pulled me over?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The officer's smirk didn't waver. If anything, it grew. "We'll get to that," he said, tapping the roof of the SUV like he was doing Shaq a favor just by talking to him. The light breeze carried a strange silence. Shaq could feel the weight of the moment settling in. A few feet away, a second patrol car slowed down as it approached the scene. The driver inside didn't get out, but the message was clear. Backup was here, just in case. Shaq exhaled slowly again, keeping his hands where the officer could see them. The cop's smile widened as he took a step back, step out of the vehicle. The air felt heavier now. Shaq could hear the faint murmurs of bystanders, the distant hum of traffic, the soft click of a phone recording nearby. He'd been in situations like this before, too many times to count, and every time it followed the same script. But this time, he wasn't in the mood to play along. He kept his hands where the officer could see them, resting them calmly on the steering wheel. His voice was even, steady. "License and registration?" The officer smirked again, the same smug expression he'd had since walking up to the car. "We'll get to that," he said, waving a dismissive hand. Instead of reaching for the documents Shaq had already offered, the officer took a slow step back and started circling the SUV, running his fingers along the glossy paint as if inspecting it for a flaw. His gaze lingered a little too long on the custom rims, the pristine detailing, the high-end finish that made the car stand out. Shaq followed him with his eyes through the side mirror, already knowing where this was headed. Another set of flashing lights appeared, a second patrol car. Shaq's jaw tightened slightly as the car eased to a stop behind the first one. Two more officers stepped out, younger than the first, but just as unreadable, their hands resting casually near. Their belts. Backup. For what? A few pedestrians had stopped walking, pretending to be interested in something on their phones, but clearly paying attention. Others didn't bother to hide their curiosity. Someone in a hoodie was already recording. Shaq shifted slightly, but not in a way that could be mistaken for aggression. He turned back to the officer, who had now returned to the front of the car. The man tapped the hood twice, tilting his head. "Nice ride," he said. "What do you do for a living?" Shaq let out a short, amused laugh. "Ah, there it is. What does that have to do with anything?" he asked, shaking his head. The officer's smirk grew. "I'm just curious." His tone was light, but his stance said otherwise. Shaq had seen this before. It was never really about curiosity. It was about control, about making him explain himself, justify why he was in a car this nice, in this part of town. The two younger officers exchanged glances, watching carefully, waiting for the conversation to escalate. Shaq could feel the tension thickening, the crowd growing, more phones being lifted, recording. The officer finally leaned in a little closer, his fake smile disappearing. His voice was lower now, sharper. "Step out of the vehicle." Shaq's grip tightened on the wheel for just a fraction of a second. The weight of the moment pressed down. He knew exactly where this was going, but the officer had no idea what was coming next. The air around them was thick with tension. Shaq could hear the distant murmurs of the growing crowd, the faint hum of traffic, and the unmistakable sound of phone cameras clicking on. People were watching, recording, waiting. He exhaled slowly, keeping his movements deliberate as he reached for the door handle. He wasn't about to give them an excuse. The heavy door of his SUV swung open, and as Shaq stepped out, the atmosphere shifted. His towering frame emerged from the car like a giant unfolding. The officer's smug smirk flickered, just for a second, but he quickly recovered, adjusting his stance to regain control. "Hands on the hood." Shaq didn't argue. He knew how this game worked. He moved to the front of the SUV, planting his massive hands firmly on the hood. A few murmurs rippled through the onlookers. Someone whispered, "Why are they treating him like a criminal?" Another person muttered, "Man, that's Shaq." The officer, still trying to maintain the illusion of authority, stepped forward and began a pat-down, one that lasted far longer than necessary. His hands moved over Shaq's shoulders, down his sides, then to his pockets, pausing just long enough to make it clear he was looking for something. Shaq clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to roll his eyes. He'd been through this before, but this time something felt different. The officer's hands paused near Shaq's waistband. "Carrying anything you shouldn't be?" Shaq let out a short laugh. "Like what? A basketball?" The crowd chuckled. Even the two younger officers near the patrol car exchanged glances, sensing the moment slipping away from their superior's grasp. Meanwhile, the third officer, who had been running Shaq's information, was still inside the patrol car, staring at the screen. His posture was rigid, his fingers hesitating over the keyboard. Back near the SUV, the lead officer continued his little performance. "You sure you're clear? No outstanding warrants? No tickets you forgot to pay?" His tone dripped with condescension. Shaq finally turned his head slightly, locking eyes with the officer. "You tell me." The smirk was back. The officer turned toward the patrol car. "What's the word? Anything interesting?" The third officer hesitated. He swallowed hard, his face pale as he stepped out of the car. Sir?" His voice was quieter than before. "We might have a problem." The lead officer's confidence wavered. He frowned, stepping toward the patrol car. "What kind of problem?" The younger officer hesitated again, shifting nervously as he glanced between Shaq and his superior. Shaq didn't move, but his mind was already racing. He wasn't worried. He knew his record was spotless. But something was happening, something the officer wasn't expecting. The crowd leaned in closer, the cameras zooming in. The lead officer's smirk vanished as he looked at the screen. His body stiffened. This wasn't just a routine stop anymore. The third officer's voice was barely above a whisper, but Shaq caught it. "Sir, this isn't just some guy." The lead officer's smirk faltered. His confident posture stiffened, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "What are you talking about?" he muttered, still trying to maintain control. The younger officer turned the patrol car's screen slightly, showing him the results of the license check. Whatever he saw made his expression shift from smug arrogance to something resembling panic. His eyes darted back to Shaq, then down at the ID in his hand. He blinked. "Wait, the Shaquille?" His voice cracked slightly, as if he couldn't believe what he was saying. Shaq remained stone-faced, arms crossed over his broad chest. "Didn't seem to matter when you pulled me over," he said coolly. The crowd, already murmuring, erupted into louder whispers. More phones were lifted, cameras zooming in, catching every detail of the officer's reaction. The energy of the moment had completely shifted. Just minutes ago, the officer had been in complete control, enjoying his little power trip. Now, he looked like a man trying to hold onto a rope that was slipping through his fingers. I was just doing a routine check. The officer tried to recover, clearing his throat. You understand, right? Just making sure everything's good. Shaq let out a short laugh, shaking his head. Routine? He gestured to the second patrol car that had arrived for backup. Didn't feel like a routine stop. The officer opened his mouth, but no words came out. The crowd wasn't having it either. Nah, don't switch up now, a voice called from the sidewalk. A young man, probably in his early 20s, stepped forward, phone aimed directly at the cop's face. You were about to arrest him 5 minutes ago. The crowd responded, voices overlapping. Yeah, you patted him down like he was some criminal. Now you acting brand new, 'cause you know who he is? You had your hand on your taser the whole time, bro. The officer's face flushed red. He was losing the room fast. Shaq could tell he was running through options in his head, searching for a way out. He glanced at his fellow officers, as if hoping for backup, but they weren't stepping in. The younger officer who had identified Shaq looked outright uncomfortable now, shifting on his feet, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The second officer, the one who had arrived in the backup patrol car, had subtly taken a step back, clearly wanting no part of the mess unfolding. It was just the lead officer now, standing under the weight of dozens of watching eyes and rolling cameras. He straightened his posture, clearing his throat again. Listen, there's no need to escalate things. We're just doing our job. Shaq arched an eyebrow. Your job? His deep voice was calm, but it carried power. Tell me something. At what point in your job do you pull someone over for nothing? Make them step out for nothing and frisk them for nothing? More murmurs. The officer's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. Save it. Shaq cut him off. He turned to face the growing crowd, speaking not just to them, but to the cameras filming. This happens every day, he said, voice steady. Not just to me, to people who don't have cameras, to people who don't have money, to people who don't have a name you recognize. Silence. The moment was heavy and everyone felt it. The lead officer shifted uncomfortably. We were just following protocol. Shaq took a step closer, his towering frame nearly swallowing the man in front of him. Oh yeah? He tilted his head slightly. And what's the protocol for when the whole world is watching? The officer's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The second officer suddenly reached for his radio. Captain? You might want to get down here. The officer let out an awkward chuckle, the kind that barely masked his growing panic. His smirk from earlier was long gone, replaced by an uneasy tightness around his mouth. He glanced around at the growing crowd, then back at Shaq, as if searching for a way to regain control. We just had to make sure, procedure and all, he said, waving a hand like this was no big deal. Shaq didn't budge. His deep, measured voice cut through the officer's weak attempt at damage control. Procedure? Shaq repeated, taking a slow step forward. The officer instinctively stepped back. You never even ran my plates. The crowd reacted instantly. Oh, he got you now, a young man called out. Another voice joined in. Yeah, how you doing procedure without even checking his tags? The lead officer's face flushed a deeper shade of red. His backup officers shifted uncomfortably, as if realizing how bad this was looking. The second officer, the one who had been silent for most of the stop, cleared his throat and glanced at the lead officer. Sir, maybe we should... The lead officer shot him a sharp look, cutting him off before he could finish, but it was too late. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating, pressing down on him with every second that passed. Shaq wasn't done. You pulled me over for nothing, he said, voice steady. You made me get out for nothing. You patted me down for nothing. Now you're trying to talk your way out of it? The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. More phones were raised, camera lights blinking. This was about to explode. The lead officer wiped his brow, clearly feeling the weight of the moment. We're just doing our job, he tried again, but his voice lacked conviction. Shaq let out a short laugh, shaking his head. Yeah? What part of your job involves harassing innocent people? The officer's jaw clenched. He looked at his fellow officers for support, but they weren't stepping in. Even they could see this was spiraling out of control. The second officer subtly stepped back, putting distance between himself and his superior. The youngest officer, the one who had realized who Shaq was, looked like he wanted to be anywhere but here. The crowd wasn't letting up. You wouldn't have pulled him over if he was in a beat-up car, huh? You all didn't even have a reason. We saw the whole thing. This ain't right. The officer inhaled sharply, trying to maintain control of the situation. But Shaq could see it. He was cracking. The weight of public scrutiny of those rolling cameras was bearing down on him. Then Shaq did something that changed everything. He reached into his pocket. The officer stiffened, his hand instinctively twitching toward his holster. The crowd gasped, tension peaking. But Shaq didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out his phone. The screen lit up as he tapped the camera app. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted it, pointing it directly at the officer. The officer swallowed hard. Shaq's voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the steel behind it. "Let's make sure the world sees this procedure you're talking about." The officer's face went pale as the recording started. Now he wasn't just dealing with Shaq. He was dealing with millions of eyes watching his every move. The second Shaq hit record, the energy shifted. The lead officer's posture stiffened, his eyes flickering between Shaq's phone and the growing number of bystanders doing the exact same thing. He had lost control of the situation, and he knew it. The second officer, the one who had been uneasy from the start, took an almost imperceptible step backward. His hand, which had been resting near his belt, now hung loosely at his side. He wasn't about to go down with his partner. But the lead cop, he wasn't giving up that easily. "You can't record me without permission," he snapped, trying to regain an ounce of authority. His voice wavered just enough for Shaq to catch it. Shaq tilted his head, smirking. "Pretty sure I can. Public place, public servant, doing your public duty." He gestured around. "And unless you've got something to hide," the crowd ate it up. "Yeah, officer," a man called out. "What you hiding?" "Why'd you really stop him?" someone else added. A teenager, no older than 16, cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, "Run the plates, do your job!" The officer's jaw clenched. The tension in the air was unbearable, thick like a brewing storm. He was stuck. If he let Shaq go, he'd be admitting this was a mistake, that he'd profiled him, harassed him for no reason other than the car he was driving and the color of his skin. But if he doubled down, if he tried to justify his actions now, with half the block recording, this could end his career. He knew it. Shaq knew it, and so did the crowd. A bead of sweat trickled down the officer's temple. He glanced at his backup, but the second officer wasn't looking at him anymore. The third, the younger one, was staring at the ground, pretending he wasn't part of this disaster. Then, before the officer could make his move, another car pulled up. A sleek black SUV, tinted windows, smooth, silent, powerful. The entire street seemed to hold its breath. The SUV came to a slow stop at the curb, and then the door swung open. Out stepped a man in a tailored navy blue suit, crisp and clean, as if he had walked straight out of a corporate office. He adjusted his silver cufflinks, took a measured step forward, and locked eyes with Shaq. Then he turned to the officer. Calm, calculated, unbothered. The officer's entire demeanor shifted. His back straightened. His eyes widened. His lips pressed into a firm line. Because this wasn't just some random bystander. This was Bryce Harrington, Shaq's lawyer. And if there was one thing the officer knew for certain, it was that men like Bryce Harrington didn't show up unless things were about to get very bad for people like him. The lead officer swallowed hard, realizing that whatever was coming next, he wasn't ready for it. The second Bryce Harrington stepped out of the SUV, the atmosphere shifted. The lead officer, who had been acting smug and in control, suddenly looked less sure of himself. His eyes flickered with unease as the sharply dressed lawyer strode toward Shaq with an air of quiet authority. The crowd, still filming, began murmuring, sensing that something big was about to happen. Bryce adjusted his silver cufflinks as he approached Shaq, his tailored navy blue suit crisp and pristine. He didn't rush. He didn't acknowledge the officers at all. His focus was entirely on Shaq. "They giving you trouble?" Bryce asked, his voice even, but loud enough for the bystanders to hear. Shaq, still leaning against his SUV with his arms crossed, gave a short chuckle. "Let's just say I've had smoother traffic stops." Bryce sighed, shaking his head slightly. "Of course." He finally turned his attention to the lead officer, his sharp eyes assessing the man in front of him. He took his time, making the officer squirm under the weight of his stare. The officer cleared his throat and stepped forward, trying to regain control of the situation. "Sir, this is police business." Bryce didn't let him finish. "I wasn't talking to you." The officer flinched. The crowd erupted. "Nah, he did not just... Oh, he got a lawyer. The officer's jaw clenched, his grip tightening around his belt. He was clearly not used to being spoken to like this, especially not in front of an audience. Bryce remained calm, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. "Now," he said, clasping his hands together, "before we continue, let's get something straight." He gestured toward Shaq. My client has complied with every request. He has provided his license, his registration. He stepped out of the vehicle when asked. He allowed you to search him without resistance. So now, I have one simple question for you." Bryce took a slow step forward, lowering his voice just enough to add weight to his words. "Is my client free to go, or are you unlawfully detaining him?" Silence. The officer's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. His eyes darted to his partner, who subtly shook his head as if to say, "Don't make this worse." The second officer, who had previously stood tall, now took a cautious step back, suddenly looking as if he wanted no part of this. The lead officer hesitated. If he said Shaq was not free to go, he'd need a valid legal reason, one he didn't have, and with multiple cameras rolling, with a high-powered attorney now involved, any misstep could mean disaster. Bryce's voice remained sharp but professional. "You pulled over a law-abiding citizen. You escalated the situation without cause, and now you're in over your head." He took another step forward, lowering his tone so only the officer could hear. "Fix this before it becomes a lawsuit." The officer's fingers twitched. His face was beginning to glisten with sweat. He was stuck. Then, making things infinitely worse for him, another police vehicle pulled up. The door swung open and a high-ranking police captain stepped out, his expression thunderous. He wasn't looking at Shaq. He was looking directly at the officer. The captain slammed the car door shut, took one glance at the crowd and growled, "Tell me you didn't just do what I think you did." The moment the second police cruiser pulled up, the energy in the air shifted. The lead officer, who had been doing his best to stay in control, suddenly looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on thin ice. The crowd had been murmuring before, but now they were waiting for the fallout. The car door swung open, and out stepped a police captain in a neatly pressed uniform, his expression like thunder. He didn't waste time assessing the situation. His eyes locked onto the lead officer immediately, and his face hardened with barely concealed fury. He didn't look at Shaq. He didn't look at the lawyer. He didn't even look at the crowd. He walked straight up to the officer, stopping just inches from his face. His voice was low, cold, controlled. "Tell me you didn't just do what I think you did." The lead officer swallowed hard but tried to keep his composure. "Sir, it was just a misunderstanding." "Save it." The captain didn't raise his voice, but the weight of his words made it clear. "You're done talking." The crowd reacted immediately. "Oh, he's in trouble now." "Yeah, go ahead and try to talk your way out of this one." Shaq stayed quiet, watching the scene unfold with arms crossed. The second officer, who had been slowly backing away earlier, now looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. Bryce Harrington, Shaq's lawyer, stepped forward, cool and professional as always. "Captain," he said, extending a hand, "I assume you're here to rectify this situation." The captain hesitated only a second before shaking Bryce's hand. His grip was firm, but his jaw was still tight with anger. "Mr. Harrington," he said, then turned to Shaq. "Mr. O'Neill, I apologize on behalf of the department." Shaq nodded but didn't say anything yet. He wasn't going to let them smooth this over that easily. The captain turned back to the lead officer. "So," he said, arms crossed now, "walk me through this misunderstanding." The lead officer licked his lips, his confidence completely shattered. We made a routine traffic stop." The captain cut him off. "And? Did he break any laws?" The officer shifted uncomfortably. "No, sir." "Did he resist arrest?" "No, sir." "Then why?" the captain asked, his voice turning deadly quiet. "Is there a crowd? Why are there multiple recordings of this? Why is his lawyer here before you even called it in?" The lead officer had no answer. His mouth opened, then closed. His partner looked down at his shoes. The captain exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "I swear you just made my entire day worse." Shaq finally spoke, his voice steady but firm. "I appreciate the apology," he said, then let a beat of silence pass before adding, "but that doesn't answer my question." The captain turned to him. "Which is?" Shaq met his gaze head-on. "What happens to cops who lie?" Silence. The question hung in the air like a hammer waiting to drop. The crowd, which had been buzzing with murmurs, went dead silent. Even the captain hesitated. The lead officer's face turned pale. The captain exhaled and finally answered, but it wasn't what anyone expected. The moment the captain's voice rang out, the atmosphere shifted. The crowd, which had been murmuring and recording quietly, suddenly came alive. Gasps, hushed whispers, and even a few cheers rippled through the onlookers as they processed what they had just heard. "Hand over your badge." The lead officer stood frozen. His face, which had carried nothing but arrogance minutes ago, was now completely drained of color. "Sir, wait, he stammered. his voice barely above a whisper. The captain's eyes were locked onto him, unwavering. There was no room for negotiation. Now. A thick silence stretched between them, the weight of the command sinking in. The officer's hand instinctively reached toward his badge but hesitated. His fingers hovered over the metal, as if refusing to accept what was happening. For years that badge had been his shield, his symbol of authority, and now, in front of dozens of cameras, he was being stripped of it. Shaq stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching with a sharp gaze. He had seen this type of officer before. Men who abused their power, convinced they were untouchable. But today, the system wasn't protecting him. Slowly, with trembling fingers, the officer unpinned the badge from his chest. It felt heavier in his hand than it ever had before. He glanced around as if searching for an escape, some last-minute intervention that would undo this. But the second officer, his own partner, had already taken a step back, distancing himself from the fallout. With visible reluctance, the disgraced officer extended the badge toward the captain. The moment it left his grip, the air felt different. The crowd inhaled collectively, waiting for what came next. The captain took the badge without a word, his fingers tightening around it. Then, his voice cut through the tension once more. "Your weapon, too." The officer's eyes widened in disbelief. His mouth opened, then closed again, struggling to form words. That request hit even harder. The badge? That was power. But the gun? That was control. For a long second, he didn't move. His mind raced through the possibilities. Could he argue? Fight this? Demand a union rep? But none of that would save him now. With his hands visibly shaking, he reached for his holster, unclipped the strap, and pulled out his department-issued firearm. The weight of it suddenly felt crushing. He hesitated again, just a second too long. The captain's jaw clenched. "Do not make me ask again." Swallowing hard, the officer handed over the weapon. The crowd exploded. People cheered, some clapping, others shaking their heads in disbelief. "Finally, some accountability. Guess you're not so tough now, huh? Take his gun? Oh, it's over for him." The energy in the air was electric. This wasn't just about Shaq anymore. This moment was bigger than him, bigger than one traffic stop. It was about all the people who had been in this same position, with no cameras, no witnesses, and no powerful lawyers to show up for them. Shaq remained silent, his arms still crossed, but his presence alone spoke volumes. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't smiling. He was just watching. The officer, now disarmed and disgraced, took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling unevenly. He looked around, seeing nothing but judgmental eyes and raised phones. Finally, the captain spoke again. "You're officially suspended pending investigation." It was the final blow. The officer's shoulders sagged. It was over. More cheers erupted from the crowd, but Shaq wasn't clapping. Instead, he took a single step forward. The moment he moved, the excitement dipped slightly, replaced by curiosity. Shaq's deep voice carried over the noise. "Oh, I'm taking this further." Instantly, the atmosphere shifted again. The celebration died down just a little. The crowd murmured, eyes darting between Shaq and the captain. The captain turned his head slowly, locking eyes with Shaq. His face remained neutral, but there was something unreadable in his gaze. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Shaq exhaled sharply, glancing toward the bystanders who had recorded every second of the interaction. "Suspension isn't justice." His tone was calm, but there was a razor-sharp edge to it. The captain's expression tightened. "What are you suggesting?" Shaq glanced at the officer, who now looked small without his badge and gun. The same man who had smirked at him moments ago, who had tried to humiliate him, now stood in the middle of the street, stripped of everything that had made him feel invincible. Shaq turned back to the captain. "What happens to cops who lie?" The words sliced through the air like a knife. The crowd stilled. The captain inhaled slowly, exhaling through his nose. His hesitation spoke volumes, but before he could answer, a voice rang out from behind them. A new player had just entered the game. The second Shaq hit post, the internet took over. Within seconds, notifications flooded his phone. Likes, retweets, comments pouring in at a speed even he wasn't used to. "Another misunderstanding. You see what we deal with?" That was all he wrote. No long explanation, no hashtags, just raw footage and a caption that spoke for itself. And that was enough. Trending number 1. Shaq exposes dirty cop. The video spread like wildfire. People who had never met Shaq, never followed him, never even cared about basketball, were now glued to their screens. Retweets came from major celebrities. "This right here is why we keep our cameras rolling. Props to Shaq for standing his ground. At RealJZ, Suspended? That's it? Nah, we need real accountability. At Gab Union news stations picked up the footage, airing it nationwide. On cable news, anchors debated what had happened. Was this racial profiling or just poor policing? One commentator asked. We've seen too many cases like this. Shaquille O'Neal's status is what saved him. But what about the people who don't have millions of followers? Another replied. The discussion wasn't just about Shaq anymore. It was about something bigger. Meanwhile, on social media, the takes came hard and fast. This could have gone so differently if he wasn't Shaq. How many people get pulled over like this every day without cameras to protect them? That officer was smirking at the start and scared by the end. Tells you everything you need to know. The police department's official Twitter account had stayed silent for the first hour. Then 2, then 3. People flooded their posts with comments. Y'all gonna say something? Or just wait for this to die down? Waiting for the, we take this very seriously copy-paste statement. And then, finally, they cracked. Breaking. Police Department issues statement. The tweet read, "We are aware of an incident involving one of our officers during a routine traffic stop. We take all allegations of misconduct seriously and are currently conducting a thorough internal investigation." It was the exact opposite of what people wanted to hear. Replies came in instantly. Translation. We're hoping y'all forget by tomorrow. Investigating what? The video is right there. If this wasn't Shaq, we all know how this would have ended. Shaq watched all of this unfold from his phone, leaning back in his chair. His face was calm, but his mind was already working. The department thought they could smooth this over with vague words. They had no idea. He was just getting started. Shaq dials a number. "Yeah, I need a press conference. Let's turn up the heat." The apology. No one believes. The press conference was a disaster before it even began. Flashes from cameras filled the room, reporters speaking over each other, microphones shoved forward, all waiting for the police chief to speak. Shaq sat in the front row, arms crossed, watching. He wasn't here to be a guest. He was here to make sure they felt the pressure. Finally, the police chief stepped up to the podium, cleared his throat, and began to read from a prepared statement. "We do not tolerate racial profiling. The department is committed to fair and just policing for all citizens, regardless of race, status, or background. After a thorough investigation, we have determined that Officer Randall acted outside of department protocols. Effective immediately, he has been terminated from his position." Silence. Then, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, but most weren't impressed. Shaq could hear the people behind him whispering, "That's it? They only fired him because they got caught. What about all the people who didn't have cameras rolling?" Shaq leaned forward, locking eyes with the chief. "That's it?" he asked out loud, his deep voice carrying over the noise. The chief hesitated, gripping the podium a little tighter. He clearly didn't expect Shaq to speak. "Mr. O'Neal," the chief started, voice stiff. "We understand your frustration, but we have taken the appropriate disciplinary action." Shaq stood up. "So, what happens to all the other people he's pulled over? The ones without cameras? The ones who didn't go viral?" The room went still. The reporters turned their full attention to Shaq. The chief hesitated again. We'll be reviewing past complaints." Shaq smirked. "Past complaints? Or past cover-ups?" The reporters pounced. "Chief, can you confirm if Officer Randall had previous complaints against him? How many reports of misconduct were ignored? Is there a systemic issue within the department?" The chief's face paled. He had lost control of the room. Shaq turned to the cameras. "This isn't just about me. It's about every single person who never got justice. The internet took it from there. Trending number 1. Justice for who? The department's attempt to bury the issue had backfired. Hard. People demanded full transparency. How many officers like Randall were still in uniform? How many wrongful arrests had been made? Within hours, the city council announced an independent investigation. But for Shaq, it still wasn't enough. He picked up his phone. "Yeah, I think it's time we take this national. Bigger than one case." The city was still buzzing from the press conference disaster. The police chief's weak apology had backfired, and Shaq knew it. The department had hoped that firing one officer would make the problem disappear, but it only raised more questions. Shaq wasn't about to let this die down. The morning after the press conference, he stood on the steps of the city courthouse. A crowd gathered in front of him. This time, he wasn't alone. Beside him stood a lineup of civil rights attorneys, activists, and community leaders. Behind him, the very people who had recorded his traffic stop, the same people who weren't celebrities, who didn't have millions of followers, who had been pulled over, harassed, or worse, without anyone to stand up for them. Shaq stepped up to the mic. his deep voice carrying over the restless crowd. This was never about just one cop. This was about a system that protects bad cops while good people suffer. And that ends today. Reporters fired questions immediately. Shaq, what do you mean by that? Are you planning to take legal action? Do you believe this department has a pattern of racial profiling? Shaq raised a hand, silencing the chaos. Then he dropped the bombshell. Starting today, I'm putting my money where my mouth is. I'm funding a legal team, some of the best lawyers in the country, to fight racial profiling cases across this city. If you've been stopped unfairly, targeted, or harassed because of how you look, we will fight for you. The crowd erupted. People cheered. Some chanted his name. The reporters went wild. The police department? They had no response. Trending number 1. Shaq fights back. By nightfall, the internet had exploded. Personal stories flooded social media. People who had been pulled over for no reason. People who had lost jobs, lost homes, lost their freedom because of routine mistakes. Shaq scrolled through the messages late into the night. Some broke his heart. Some made him furious. One message stood out. A mother. Her son had been arrested on false charges 6 months ago. No camera, no proof, no celebrity status to back him up. She wrote, I don't know if you'll ever see this, but if you do, please don't stop. Some of us have been fighting for years, and no one ever listened. Shaq clenched his jaw, his grip tightening around his phone. The police department had messed with the wrong person. He looked into the cameras the next morning and smirked. This wasn't about me. This was about every person who didn't have a camera when it happened to them.